Good afternoon and welcome back. So welcome back to the symposium we have titled Constructions of Time, Still and Moving Imagery. This exhibition, this symposium really has come about because of the convergence of the current exhibitions over at the power plant. So when this afternoon session ends, we're really glad to invite everyone back to the power plant for a reception, during which in the front of house you can enjoy some beverages and some snacks. But it will also be an opportunity, if you have not been through our current exhibitions, including Leslie Hewitt Collective Stance, to go into the galleries and view the artwork. We'll start this afternoon session with the artist herself, Leslie Hewitt, who received her BFA from the Cooper Union, studied Africana Cultural Studies at New York University, and graduated with an MFA from Yale University. Recent solo exhibitions have been held at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago, Sigma Jenkins & Co. in New York, the Contemporary Art Museum, St. Louis, Des Moines Art Center in Iowa, the Menil Collection in Houston, Art Pace in San Antonio, the Studio Museum in Harlem, the Kitchen in New York, the Center for Curatorial Studies, and the Hessel Museum of Art, Bard College, and LA Art Los Angeles. Hewitt has also participated in several biennials, including the Göteborg International Biennial for Contemporary Art in Sweden and the 2008 Whitney Biennial in New York. So without further delay, please welcome Leslie Hewitt.
Thank you for the introduction, and please forgive my voice. I'm a little sick, but hopefully a little rumble in the voice maybe is attractive, but please forgive me. So in the announcement, it says that it states that I would show a screening or screen a few pieces, which I am not going to do, but how I framed this talk today was to kind of lead up to the body of work that's presently here at the power plant and is meant to be experienced. So the kind of mediated version of it is less attractive to me. Also I would like to say before I begin, I do have notes I am reading, but I will read at the beginning and then start to kind of move into something more conversational and then open it up for open questions and hopefully a discussion that will also lead into later with the other speakers. And one last caveat. So I often will refer to images that are not mine with a caption. So images that are mine will not have a caption. Images that are not mine will have a caption. And I won't necessarily stop to speak about each work. So hopefully the counterpoint of my thoughts, questions that I have, and the image create a nice counterpoint that's enriching. So forgive me if it's confusing. I'll rethink it later. Okay. We practiced this, didn't we? Okay. What if each time we look at a photographic image, we understand it as a physical object, the trace of where light meets surface, where fields of color meet texture? What if we understood a photographic image as an abstraction of facts extracted from the fullness, from life in its fullness and dimension? I understand photography in this way, as a compressed version of the world, funneled through a monocular point of view. I focus the camera lens acutely within seemingly everyday situations, with the desire to reveal several perspectives at once, to construct a kind of supervision. This is very awkward. I feel like I can't. Is it okay if I ask if you can forward? Okay. I look often at the work, spatial acts of Gordon Mata Clark, seeing the language of geometry in his site-specific works, seeing the language of photography in his grand gestures, seeing architectural collage in his cuts, seeing how he flattened space sculpturally. Next image, please. His use of daylight and duration have all influenced and challenged me to investigate further the impact and constraints of photography as a medium and its relationship to our conception of space. Next image. Display and installation often mirror for me the formal relationships apparent in the work itself, emphasizing both a visual and physical experience. I find myself skirting between the illusions of photography and the undeniable physical presence of objects. I want to strengthen and build upon an acknowledged relationship with an active viewing audience. This acknowledgement for me echoes a sentiment of call and response. Each developed project is a call to an audience on an intimate and imperative level. The camera and the human eye are linked. We know this, and yet we do not know this. The act of looking immediately sets a series of power relationships into motion. Who is looking? What or who is being looked at? Is the object of someone's gaze looking back, asserting agency? What is actually taking place in this exchange? Early drawings and engravings from the 15th into the 17th century have always fascinated me and illustrate often, quite literally, the principles of perspective and the invisible bond between the design of the camera and the human eye, elaborating on the technology of sight. The technology has progressed, and I would like to place a surrogate in its place. I would like to place a surrogate in place of the older drawings of experiments with optics to point to other structures that invisibly align our collective optical gaze. I am more so interested in the abstracting surfaces we engage with, in the minutiae of our daily lives, our shifting sense of visuality, as Hito Starl would point to invisibility. I will use such images throughout this presentation as a refrain or a rupture of sorts. Next image, please. My compositions rely on the principles of sculpture and shift between the poetic and literal representations implied by each material I document. Thinking in sculptural terms pushes me to consider aspects of weight and materiality. Next image, please. With this, I have to engage with the photographic image as an object, no matter how two-dimensional or flat it appears. As an object, it traverses in space, shifting as its context shifts. This is the central force behind the photographic project, Riffs on Real Time. It is a series of durative works. They are documents of small, intimate gestures that I arrange on my studio floor and photograph the composite that results. Next image, please. Through the exploration of how time is perceived and pictured, I am drawn, like so many of us, to socially and politically charged photographs, specifically images from the mid to late 60s in the American context, really as signifiers for the destination of such images across time and space, annotating how such affect can puncture private spaces, private worlds. What occurs when the unpredictable nature of the outside world enters the seemingly safe parameters of calm interiors. Next image, please. Considering a photograph as an object radically shifts its conditions. It points to aspects like atmosphere, perspective, and context as malleable or in flux. These conditions are what I build around. I find working in this way provides a strong visual analogy for the amorphous process of memory. I'm interested in the slippages that occur in this space between individual and collective moments of recollection and the mediation of such moments in material culture. Next image, please. In creating these composites, I wonder, if this work could engage the notion of interiority. I am in essence asking for reflections on moments that are really about slowing down the process of looking by enlarging very intimate acts like looking at mementos and personal documents, or by simulating the closeness one needs to be able to read comfortably standard text on the page of a book. Emphasis is placed on engagement. There is a tension that suspends the image in time, and that is where I want the work to remain suspended. Next image, please. Casual photography contains strong internal worlds that pull inward. I'm immediately attracted to them. They are obviously specific and particular. There is this assumption of familiarity embedded in their framing and their everyday assertions. It is a quick gesture, evocative of the capturing of 1/16 of a second with perceived ease. There is no need for details like sharpening the focus or ensuring that everything fits perfectly in a set of given edges. Next image, please. Though unconventional, compositionally, snapshots encompass everything one desires to remember. I enjoy the liberation in snapshots. I often imagine that they are able to capture more than what is tangible, but able to capture what is intangible, like the sounds evoked in the city scene or the intensity of light you can almost feel. They are rich with time and only reveal it through fragments that act as triggers for remembrance. Next image, please. Avoiding any kind of direct narrative with this work, the repetition and pacing of the work in space and real time act as a surrogate for the narrative desire in the installation. In addition, there is another shift. I often create some kind of intervention in the installation of this work that operates in a similar way. What often occurs is the construction of an architectonic form that not only echoes the succession of openings in the photographs, but is built to mirror the dimensions of a specific opening found in the actual space, calling upon corporeal spatial memory. Next image. This responsibility I feel to address the space, both seen and unseen or less seen, in some way is expressed clearly by artist Daniel Buren, which I will quote here. We could speak of the internal architecture of a painting or of any work of art. However, the work of art can only be seen, experienced in the context of the space surrounding it, the space for which it was destined, and to which, however, no special attention is paid. Next image. My compositions are restrictive. I rely on certain formal principles to push tension between opacity and visual clarity. Riffs on Real Time documents the act of looking, collapsing one thing into another, creating new relationships through perspective or the lack thereof. These rules are embedded in the form of photography and are in each photograph. The relationship is simple. I only embellish by my act of photographing and installing. Next image. In Anne Friedberg's book, The Virtual Window, there is a beautiful passage where she expands on this notion of framing vision and the photograph as a metaphor for a window, all of which are embedded in the medium. The window is an opening, an aperture for light and ventilation. It opens, it closes, it separates the spaces of here and there, inside and outside, in front of and behind. The window opens onto a three-dimensional world. Beyond, it is a membrane where surface meets depth, where transparency meets its barrier. Next image. The window is also a frame, a proscenium. Its edges hold a view in place. The window reduces the outside to a two-dimensional surface. The window becomes a screen. Like the window, the screen is at once a surface and a frame, a reflective plane onto which an image is cast, and a frame that limits its view. The screen is a component piece of architecture, rendering a wall permeable to ventilation in new ways. A virtual window that changes the materiality of built space, adding new apertures that dramatically alter our conception of space and even more radically of time. Next image, please. We know the world by what we see through an opening, a window, a frame, on a screen. As we spend more of our time staring into frames set forth by computers and handheld devices, windows full of moving images, text, icons, and other such graphic modes, including skeuomorphs, stress how the world is framed may be as important as what is contained within them. Next image, please. A frame art historically is usually a structure that supports and protects a work of art, creating demarcation, defining where the illusion begins and where it ends. In order to interrogate this convention, what if the frame's function shifts from the less seen status to the seen? What if the frame obeys the law of gravitation, and metaphorically, the weight of the images become physical, as if the content was too heavy to hang, in quotes, on the wall. This rooting, coupled with the scale and the choice to leave the use of glass as a transparent protective surface, allows the viewer to virtually enter the work. The space of the installation as a whole becomes a site of implications for the construction of meaning. Next image, please. Several time-worn objects are composed in a balancing act. This notion of balancing is apparent not only literally in the arrangement, but also in the unsaid relationships between seemingly banal circumstances of several pictures that I just showed. Objects reverberate with pointed political references, such as a partially visible title, Black Protests, History, Documents, and Analyses, 1619 to the Present, by Joanne Grant, printed in 1968, and the Kerner Report of the National Advisory Commission of Civil Disorders, commissioned by the United States federal government in 1967, released in 1968. The spines of these texts provide a solid support, and in other cases collapse literally and figuratively in each composition. Like a constellation, the central axis in the work is always in relation to images of familial life, simple but equally as rich. These moments are snapshots of family gatherings. They set up a series of counterpoints to the visual narratives the titles of such books may imply. Here, the juxtaposition of life in its most mundane and beautiful are set in stark contrast to the very social and political flux printed in such books in 1968. New scenarios play out over time, constructing and deconstructing and reconstructing, all while the passage of time shifts and sunlight moves from its zenith to the setting of the sun, creating heavier and longer shadows, blowing out aspects of the images, where once only legible become now blocks of color. Next image, please. The central axis in the work is this rectangular object that I would like to call a screen, primarily because it functions this way. In the work, it sits in the immediate center as a site for projection. The books and the accounts associated with them act as anchors. They are foundational blocks, but what a precarious foundation. The soft materiality of the paperback books that in some cases have been thumbed listlessly lend themselves to defying gravity, even for the seconds it takes to open and close the aperture of the camera, sealing its existence, even if only for a brief moment. The texts are bound to gravity and all of the rules that apply. There is this small sculptural intervention that is mounted to the floor, considerable distance from what I call photo sculptures, creating yet another layer. It is an early edition of Eastman Kodak's book, How to Make Good Pictures, a guidebook for the everyday photographer. This intervention, in my mind, pushes against a purely nostalgic read of old photographs. This actual book serves as a small manifesto to the democratic potential of photography as a medium, though we can continue to be critical of it, hinting at the fact that the socializing force of Kodak, especially as it relates to personal photography in the 20th century, is something that links many of us. Perhaps in reality, we were all taking the same exact pictures. There are questions of displacement and personal affect in the work, moving through formal interests in structure and experience. I never attempt to know, in quotes, to project a sense of objectivity or certainty about any subject I point the lens of my camera toward, or away from the objects in which I engage in the studio. This choice to pose questions to the viewer instead of answering is a liberatory exchange. To dislodge historical data from stasis, or the stasis, perhaps in an archive, is a radical gesture, not bound by a historiographic mode. Next image, please. My primary impulse, photographing the way that I do, draws heavily from the late 60s in content, but also in art historical content. The paradigm shift that was apparent at that time, many influences, including conceptual art, photography, post-minimalism. Next image, please. Even specifically film movements bound in the mid-century and connected to social change, such as Third Cinema, Fernando Solones, The Hours of the Furnaces, for example, 1968, but also his manifesto towards the Third Cinema. Halle Garima is another filmmaker who completely influenced and shifted the way that I thought and the way that I photographed. I also have to point to David Hammons because I think the way he uses language in his sculptures also pushed me to challenge my relationship to objects and images through a haptic sense as well. Next image, please. Working in the space found in between disciplines may suggest a nearly infinite interchangeability of forms and numerous possibilities for the arrangement of objects. Images as objects and text as image, or object as image, all of which approach the notion of a historical pause that has the potential to represent the undocumented moments in and around the moments pictured. These temporal arrangements communicate a value system based on the historical significance of objects, art historically and equally engaging a social history of things. They suggest meaning created by inference instead of illustration. Next image, please. It is worth returning to Anne Friedberg's use of metaphor here as it relates to the photographic window. Metaphors are proxies, aliases, a rhetorical trope. Metaphor relies on the substitution of one thing for another, a transfer of properties from the plane of the literal to the plane of the figurative. Metaphors themselves are virtual. They reside in the immateriality of language, yet they refer to the material world. Next image, please. As the construction of meaning, like the construction of history, often takes place by the layering of multiple elements and events, the need for certain spaces of interruption might be felt. In these neutral moments, represented by the wood, the image stops speaking. In attempting to build and rebuild relationships through objects, each picture is a quiet history of sorts, referring to breaks in a timeline. This process of recombing objects is an attempt to articulate beyond what is presently possible, and is perhaps motivated by a desire to formulate a language adequate enough to describe newly emerging present-day contexts in relation to history by utilizing elements from the past. Next image, please. Film theorist and scholar Miriam Hansen, in her text Cinema Experience, identifies the subtle nature of early 20th century theorist Siegfried Kracauer's work on photography. She points out that he relates photography's precarious afterlife to the split-second nature of photographic analog exposure. That is, he locates the problem precisely in the technology, supported indexical bond, traditionally invoked to assert the photograph's accuracy and authority. In the mechanical digital reproduction of time to the moment of its origin, Kracauer observes the photograph is intrinsically more vulnerable than, for instance, film to the passage of time. Next image, please. And so this is where I pivot, and I think I'm okay, to talk about a transition that happened for me, moving from working between the relationship between sculpture and photography. I was trained as a sculptor and started to photograph my sculptures, which moved me into thinking about seriality and temporality. And in 2010, I met Bradford Young via a curator, Rashida Bumber, who introduced us. And she introduced us because she knew that I was a student, I would say, of third cinema. I didn't study film, but was extremely fascinated by what film could do that I felt that a still image couldn't. And she introduced us, and we began our journey at that point. And we realized a few things, that we were both born in '77, and I say that not to be strange, but to say that each generation, I think, has a responsibility to the world that they're in or that they're confronted with. And I think we both shared fascination and obsession, perhaps, with images and documentation of the civil rights era of mid-20th century, being 10 years kind of out of that time. So it was less of a fascination with the historical facts, but more so with how we receive those facts, or perhaps truths and half-truths, perhaps, through image. And so we started this conversation purely through bonding over our era, being born in 1977, but also the power of images and being reverent, but at the same time critical, and trying to find a way to explore both of those things. Next image, please. And sometimes institutions have a way of revitalizing their collection through a contemporary lens. And I wanted to push back, and in a way that was respectful, but also I thought it was an opportunity to leave another trace, a trace that perhaps is more generational. And so I invited Bradford Young to come down with me, and we spent, I would say, over 6 months, not 6 months consecutively, but 6 months just looking at this particular archive. And Untitled Structures comes from that stage of looking and questioning. And so I think I have some time to go through some of the images, next image, and speak through some of the questions that we had. Again, I hope everyone can read, but from where they are, but if it's not our image or my image, then there's definitely a reference there. So Arjun Appadurai states in his book, Modernity at Large, Cultural Dimensions of Globalization, and so he states, as with mediation, so with motion, the story of mass migrations, voluntary and forced, is hardly a new feature of human history, but when it is juxtaposed with the rapid flow of mass-mediated images, scripts, and sensations, we have a new order of instability in the production of modern subjectivities. Next image, please. And so it became apparent that, and I wanted to use that quote because there was something at once beautiful but also destabilized for me and Brad as we looked through the images in this particular collection. Looking for something that was recognizable, but also being struck by its beauty. And beauty without context is sometimes a very difficult position, I feel. And so at once we were questioning what wasn't in this frame, right? It's so aesthetically constructed. What's missing? What happened right before? What happened right after? We were struck by particularities. So for instance, in Danny Lyon's images, he was a member of SNCC, so his images were much more dynamic, less concerned with the idealized framing as we saw with Bruce Davison's image. Next image, please. Elliot Erwitt ended up being one of our favorites and who I think we referenced the most in our piece, Untitled Structures, which has, in our view, the metadata of that work comes from a close analyzing of the original archive. And so we were struck by his compositions, his subtlety. His images were mostly in interiors, and that we thought was also a beautiful kind of counterpoint to protest being always something that shows particular bodies. And I want to use the word abject, which I think becomes much more relevant in today's context if we think about images from the past 2 years of seeing people die and in police custody, et cetera, in the U.S., and seeing how the power of those images over and over and over again, what happens to that body, what happens to our empathy for those bodies? Is it heightened by seeing the repetition, or does something else happen? And so the range in this archive is quite striking. So can we go to the next image? Elliot Erwitt, I think also part of our response to this archive was thinking about the archive, is fact. These were images that were taken and reproduced. But we also, when we say civil rights era, we all have a historical imaginary that comes to mind. And so that's also something that we wanted to work with or try to address in our response. This is another Elliot Erwitt image. He often complicates the narrative. There's never just African Americans in his images. They are complex social settings, often economic settings that also push against perhaps a narrative that the civil rights era particularly was only specific to African Americans, more so than a larger American context. Next image, please. Another really beautiful image. The next three are still Elliot Erwitt. This is in Karlsruhe, Germany, and that's another undertone, I think, to the civil rights era that we don't often think of, is the impact of World War II and soldiers kind of fighting for kind of humanist ideals, but then returning home and not feeling that same respect in their home country. And then that also kind of galvanized an interior passion for social justice. And so these are kind of subtle images that are inserted in this archive that's worth researching, and I invite more people to actually work with this archive. There's over 240 images, and I think we were just the first to respond. Next image, please. So another image, and if we could go to the last one. So the earliest image is 1943, I believe, and the latest is 1988, which is this one. This is also Elliot Erwitt. So the archive already, just in its timeline, says something else. It's basically the 20th century in an American context. And that became interesting to me as well, to think about other things that were happening at that particular time. Migration, the Great Migration, all of these kind of subtexts that were haunting the archive but weren't visible. And so, next image, please. So we worked with this original archive. We created an image script. Next image, please. Next image, please. Yeah. Where we found our characters, if I should say that. So this body here became crucial for us. Creating a composite. So we kind of created, through selecting key images from the archive, we created our script, which is based off of images, which were fragments from various images that we created a composite. And the site specificity for our project came as we selected sites that were specific to the civil rights movement in terms of structural support. And I'll say a little bit more about that later. Okay, next image. So we worked on this project for 2 years, and primarily for legal reasons, gaining access to locations, getting insurance, all of those things that kind of prevent an easy move. We also shot using 35 millimeter film, so all of that prevented us from perhaps moving very quickly, but I actually think that benefited the project greatly. So the next series of images are also presented in the show at the Power Plant Collective Stance, because as we separated, we would come together to work and shoot, but when we were apart, I also continued to work through my relationship to the images, my relationship to that desire to make something two-dimensional come to life, to bring it closer, but also the reality is that it can never come back, right? It can't come that close. And so how to create a work that shows that tension, that desire to go back, but also with the inability to do so. So next image, please. These are images that now you have seen because it's here, but these were lithographs that I constructed from going into the archive and photographing with a micro lens, small sections, like 2 inches by 2 inches, and trying to kind of dig into the image to try to pull something forward, pull a more unknown story, a more everyday story, perhaps. Next image. And so you could go to the next image as well. Sorry. And so I started to work on these sculptures at the same time, and partly they're screens, partly they are to reference the wall. They are also to reference an aesthetic moment too that shares the civil rights era, which is minimalism, and part of working with historical data from a distance is you could collapse time in ways that I think allows for us to see movements that perhaps we see as separate, but they are contingent, they have a relationship. And so for me to quote aesthetically minimalism that in a way we have been taught, though this is changing, was apolitical, but the artists were not. The artists are political beings. We can't really fall outside of that. So to put these two modes together in relation to one another was also very important to me. Next image. And so I hope they shift, right? So as you see the film, then you come out, you shift, you move through the space, they shift, they crop people as you see them in a distance. So there's all of this kind of bodily, corporeal engagement that I hope that the work ignites. And it's not immediate, it's just, ideally I hope it is slow and creates a different relationship to space, but also to image, but also to the historical time that I'm pointing towards. Next image. And we can go to the next image. Okay, next image. How am I doing with the time? 2 minutes, okay. So I'm gonna skip this. I have more to say. So part of, I think, what I brought to this collaboration, Bradford worked on Selma after we worked on this project. Ava DuVernay got this script kind of around the time that we were working on this, so it was an amazing serendipitous moment, and I think both works do different things. But I know definitely what happened in this piece, because it's not a linear narrative, was how to evoke the time without it being a purely nostalgic. And for me, the doubling of images helps to break that. The next image, please. Actually, you could just kind of go, yeah, we could keep going. So the doubling of images, the slowing down of time, the creating epic moments through the reduction of sound, if that makes sense too. So by being in this situation where there's no sound other than the sound perhaps that's emanating from the images, a la Tina Kempt, who is a favorite scholar, speaks a lot about the sound that images make and construct. So we could stay on this one for just a second. Our response to the archive was in black and white. We had to respond in color. We didn't have to, but it felt like that would do something different. So memory is triggered through color, through texture. We point to bodily memory through posing out the figures exactly to an image. So their bodies are kind of forced to remain static in this almost uncomfortable manner. But then, right, the breaths that are taken, the blink of the eye, all of those things become epic. And so this stasis or this static image becomes alive, and it becomes alive in relation to the viewer. And sorry, I have one other thing to say. And so I started with a few quotes that to me in this process that were about kind of destabilizing the way in which we view photojournalism. And for me, that was also crucial for this project, because what was uncomfortable for me looking back at the images, now decontextualized, the images in the archive, it was trying to figure out, what happens to the narratives that are embedded in the particular image, and what about the subjectivity of the photographer, the framing, all of those things tell so much more, and we don't necessarily ask those questions. So part of our process, so you can go to the next few images. So these are just process. So part of our process was trying to create a tension in the image, and hopefully that tension also produces a questioning. And that questioning, I think, also is not only questioning the past, but also questioning our present tense. And I think, can you press play if you can do that? Yeah. Okay, so the last component of this work, which is, I think, the most important, is being able to cite all of the people who contributed to the project, but also to make sure that, or for us to make sure that we cited the locations that we shot in. The counterpoint to the original archive was also to point to architecture and locations that gave structural support, meaning financial, legal advisement. And those are things that I think also become less apparent when we remember that pivotal moment in the 20th century. So we shot at the Claiborne Temple, we shot at the Universal Life Insurance Company in Memphis, we shot at the Johnson Publishing headquarters, and in addition to the Arkansas Delta region. So there's exteriors that are significant, but also interiors. And I will now open it up for questions, 3 questions, okay, if anyone has. Sorry. And I'm sorry, I had a longer presentation, so I tried to squeeze it at the end, but I'm happy to share it if people would like more.
Thank you, Leslie.
Thank you.
I have a question about the architectural sort of intervention that's happening at the power plant, and the way that you're sort of thinking about architectural forms as a way to sort of slow down when you're walking through that exhibition. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Sure. So the sculptures or?
The environment that you walk through for stills.
Oh, okay, yes.
And then entering into the space where the sculptures are installed, and then sort of bringing you into this black box environment where Untitled Structures
Yes.
is installed.
No, I think probably much to curatorial frustration, I definitely already come into a work knowing the way it will sit in a space. And I think this comes from having a relationship to sculpture and always wanting image to have the same power as sculpture. And that may sound very obtuse to say, but a sculpture to me immediately, you have to contend with it with your body. You have to think about its scale in relationship to your body. You have to move around it, right? It asks of you to do something. Architecture also does that, but I feel like we don't question in the same way, right? It kind of moves us through space and time in ways that we feel are about safety and we trust in that way. And so my interventions are subtle at times, whether it's a leaning wall that mirrors the proportions of a proscenium, right? So it's like, even though you walk into the room, you've already recorded that, but to see it again in another context kind of brings it back. And so for the installation here, for Collective Stance, moving through the architecture, moving through these 90-degree, sorry if I sound like a mathematician right now, moving through these kind of 90-degree angles, right, for stills, to then be confronted with them again, and then to be confronted again via the inverted, right, for structures. All of it is about calling in the viewer to have much more engagement, right? Because I think one of the things that I've often took issue with photography, primarily because I often always use personal material, not necessarily my personal, but apersonal, that there is this disconnect that happens if it isn't yours. And that always frustrated me, right? So it's either you're a voyeur looking into someone else's world, or you completely disconnect. And then I also make a parallel between certain historical narratives, right, that we assume only belong to one body. And so then, right, you could also create that distance. So for me, the form is so important. That's how engagement begins, and it's undeniable. We all, right, kind of physically move through that space, and we'll have not exactly the same experiences, but I see that as a way to connect and to make a close connection with the viewer.
Hi, thanks so much.
Hi.
That was a great talk, and I have way more insight into your work, especially the work that wasn't shown in this great show. I wonder if you could speak to the use of tableau in your work. I'm very interested in tableau. It's political and affective charge, and how there's a rise of tableau in certain kinds of artists, which I won't mention, but if you look over the last 60 years, tableau has been a form of slowing down and the oxymoron, still moving, and maybe if you could speak to why tableau in your work. Thanks.
Well, I should also say that I do not have a relationship to painting at all. And for me, if I do, it came through being fascinated with trompe-l'oeil painting in particular, and that relationship to that subtle shift between illusion and reality was curious to me. But I also think, which I didn't really focus on in this talk, but I think I'm hinting at it by showing computer chips and referencing Anne Friedberg in a virtual window, is the liminal space. And I think that's something that we are transitioning into. So I'm sorry if I'm going to speak more late 20th, 21st century, and less art history to answer your question. But I think that's where the fascination for me lies, in this kind of that shallow depth of field, that shallow space that we now, via all of these devices, we kind of live in. And so my work, I think, is also mirroring that shift, that paradigm shift that we are experiencing. And if it echoes, earlier times or earlier modes in art history, then this may also speak to cycles and continuum that I can't necessarily speak on, because that wasn't my intention. My intention more so lies in my interest in the shifts that are occurring.
Yeah, I can't speak to that either. I'm a film person.
Okay.
But the figure, the human being, the stilled human being, and in a moving image. So I just wanted to speak to that practice.
Okay.
Yeah. Perhaps incorrectly, tableau.
Okay. No, I think this is true. And maybe I just wanted to say what I said, too. That's also it. But so the shift, I don't know if I will continue to work this way. This was only for this project. And it felt important to not repeat the mode, the form of the archive, our form, right? Like, which is filled with static images, still images. And so it became imperative that we quote it, but through a static shot, but also shift it to do more. And so that sweet spot, if I will say, is 24 seconds. And it's enough that, your eye settles on it, and it may perceivably be still, or even you could assume nothing is moving, but always something is, whether it's a cloud in the sky or a small, it becomes much more apparent when it's the body. But even in the images where it's just an interior, there's always something that indicates that time is passing. And so that tension for us was really about that's the space that we inhabit as viewers of the original archive, right? That space, that temporal space of looking, and then how to create a material trace of that in the work. And if it becomes something that formally kind of moves and is shared in other practices, I can't necessarily speak to that, because that wasn't where, maybe I was too myopic in this process, but I really just, we kind of went in with thinking about that as a valid response to the original archive. Thanks. Okay. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
I find that there's just like one idea that I thread throughout your presentations about the idea of framing.
Yes.
Yeah, because I think photographically, architecturally, and sculpturally, especially with those metal thing in the show. So I think I would like, maybe you can help me to unpack the idea of what you think of the technique of framing, and how you're going to take it in your future projects. Mm-hmm. Because up until this point, when you brought up the idea of how you intended the sculpture to interact with the viewers, I was always more attracted to viewing the sculpture as opposed to using it as a framing device. Mm. So maybe you can comment on the fascination with on the technique as opposed to the content that it produces.
Okay. So I may not answer you exactly. I'm sorry. I'm thinking about one particular thing that you said, so I want to respond to that first. So I think that I'm not necessarily taking great risks formally with the frame. Other than that, I wish to bring attention to the periphery of that edge. And that edge to me is similar maybe to connecting it also to the question about the relationship between the still and the moving. What is that line between the illusion or representation and reality, and how I could create many iterations of that line. So whether it's the frame within the frame within the frame and riffs on real time, or leaning the frame on the floor so that it aligns with where the wall and the floor meet in the space, and then all of a sudden we are now also implicated, or the viewer is also implicated, or now with the way that this exhibition, which I'm very pleased with and happy with, that the framing and the context is now dislodged from the rectangle is still there, but it's now something that moves freely throughout several works, and I hope to continue to be able to explore that. I mean, I think that's, as an artist, a question that I have, and hopefully I could continue to move aesthetically, formally, which I definitely feel is crucial. I think if it's not in the form, then it's not there, to be honest, or that's how I was taught, and that's the tradition that I connect to. So my form and the content have to be equal to one another. So at this point, hopefully they're almost aligned, and I hope that was okay for you. Okay. Thank you.